So troubleshooting, what happens if your worms start dying? In our climate, the 90% plus reason they might die is heat. So just know that worms like it, ideally between about 50 and 80. They can handle to 90, they can handle probably even to 95. At some point, it's just too hot. So some people say, oh, I'm gonna put it in my garage where there's shade, but there's often no breeze, you know, there's no airflow. And so it's actually sometimes even hotter in garages. So put them where there is shade, put them where there is some circulation. When it really gets too hot, I would advise bringing them inside the house. If you don't use meat and dairy, you won't have any smell, and you won't even know that you have a worm bin in the house. What happens is not just the heat really kills them, but the heat actually heats up the worm castings inside your vermicomposting bin, and in effect almost starts to like warm up or even bring to a boil practically the worm castings. It melts it and makes it warm and gushy, and the worms just can't handle that kind of heat. They can't handle freezing either, but we don't have to worry about that as much. Excuse me. I'm coughing from dry throat, guys. I'm sorry. I have liquid here, but I'm not sick or anything. I'm sorry. Just dry throat. So pest infestation. Remember I talked about fruit flies? Well, you just gotta freeze your stuff and put there, and so you don't get fruit fly eggs. And when you get them, you gotta just kind of shush them out and start freezing stuff in the future and make sure you don't get any more. These are a couple of other pests. One's called a soldier fly. The big thing about soldier flies are the larvae. For whatever reason, they like cool, dark, moist too. And you don't want soldier flies in the area, because if they lay their eggs, they're going to turn into larvae. The larvae don't bother the worms, but those larvae eat like you know what, and they will eat the food that you're trying to feed the worms. So you want to get rid of them. So get rid of your larvae. If you have chickens, you can feed them to the chickens. Get rid of your soldier flies if you see them in there. If you get ants, like sometimes you put them outside and you put them on the ground, and ants find that there's food in them, and they start doing one of their soldier lines, and they crawl in there and they go eat the food that's intended for the worms. I don't think they hurt the worms. Once again, all they're after is the food that you were giving the worms. So try elevating it. And if that doesn't work, elevate it where you put the legs of the table or whatever stand it's on in some sort of oil. And so the worms have to, the ants have to find a way to crawl through the oil onto the leg and up to the thing. The other thing about ants is they are very rigid. They like their structure. They don't like to be bothered. So if you bother them, if you move it around a few times, that's probably gonna get rid of them too. They don't wanna deal with that sort of stuff. They don't like to be pestered. So make it hard on them, pester them, and hopefully you'll get them to go away. If your bin smells bad, it's because you've used meat or dairy. And we always remind people, don't let your cats confuse it for kitty litter. And once again, you don't want to use cat or dog feces. You can use manure from your horse or goat or sheep or whatever, but not feces. Okay, next slide. Okay, and so there's some really good resources for vermicomposting. One is this Worms Eat My Garbage. Hopefully we're a resource for you guys. We want you guys to go on rcwaste.org or call us anytime, but this is a really good book. The next slide is our online classes, which we have them in English and Spanish, where you can review what we've talked about today. These are much shorter. These are like 10-minute long videos that take you through, but you can stop it and you can also see how it happens. So if you want to go through this class again, or if you have any questions after we get off the call and you want to see it again, go to rcwaste.org/classes, and you can see them in English and Spanish. And then the next slide is just a reminder that we do sell the bins normally, but we got to wait for our lobby to open. So right now they're not, But if you try us in a couple of months when things stage 3 or whatever starts happening, stage 4, then give us a call and see if we're open and let us sell you a bin. We're selling it for the cost of the bin. We're not adding any profit. These are the cost of the materials to us to buy these materials, and then we drilled the holes and did other things for you. Final thing is just thank you, and here's a link. If you have any feedback on this presentation, we'd love to hear it. And in general, anytime you guys have any questions, you need any help, there's a recycling department here. We're all specialists in recycling and composting and vermicomposting and California recycling laws and all these things that have to do with waste diversion. So just call 951-486-3200 and ask to speak to a recycling specialist, and any one of us can help you. Okay, were there any questions?
We have a couple of questions in the chat. Evan asked about picking up worms from a local composting facility, and he said he heard you mention San Jacinto, and he's wondering if you know the name of the place.
So the one I'm thinking of is called Cottonwood Compost, but there's also another one. It's like a play on it, like Dr. Worm or something. But in general, if you do Google search and you say, red worms, manure worms, whatever, you will find places. So manure worms, Riverside, California, or the zip code or whatever, and you'll find places.
And then another question that we have is not using avocado pits, but can you use avocado skins?
So I would categorize that as one of those things that's just going to take a really long time to decompose and get mushy. A little bit like orange skins. A watermelon rind gets pretty mushy pretty quickly, but you put oranges in there and they just don't. And the same thing with the avocado skins and the avocado pits. Just those things that if you just sort of logically think this is probably going to take a long time before it starts to get kind of moldy or starts to decompose and get mushy. Probably shouldn't go in there. You're probably not going to hurt anything, but when you harvest, you're going to have avocado pits and orange peels and just stuff like that to deal with, rather than just worms and worm castings.
Another question is, how small should people make the food scraps? Should they stop feeding a few weeks before harvesting the compost?
So those are two good questions. How small? I don't think the size really matters as long as they can get mushy. One of the things that I do in the summer, because I'm a weirdo and I love my worms, is I make little igloos for them with the watermelon rinds. I freeze it and I put 3 or 4 rinds together to sort of make a little pop-up tent for them, so that they can go in there and get cool. It's not small chunks of watermelon, it's like those triangular slices, those wedges that you cut. So it's really not about the size, it's about how mushy they will get. By the way to know how often to feed them is based on your personal experience. In other words, you have a few worms, you put some food in there, you come back a week later and you notice that there's food there. Well, maybe you overfed them. Or you put some, you fed them and you come back a week later and all the food is gone. You think, maybe I underfed them. So you got to kind of adjust. And as the worm population grows, you're going to adjust. You're going to add more. I'm telling you, they go through watermelon. I love watermelon, so I feed them a lot of watermelon. But they go through that stuff. They go through cucumbers and tomato. They love all that stuff. But I can put almost an entire, completely whole watermelon rind thing in there, and they might be gone like in 4 days when my worms are really well populated. And then what was the second part of that question again?
Should they stop feeding a few weeks before harvesting the compost?
Yes, that's a very good point. Yes. By the way, the worms will not only eat the newspaper at the beginning and the end, but worms will eat their own castings. So they will actually make them more nutritious. They'll eat them and digest them again. And that's not really what you want to feed them, because our goal is to divert food waste. Instead of throwing things out, we want to put in the worm bin. We want to let them turn it into castings. But when you're ready to harvest, when you're thinking it's heavy, I would go ahead and stop putting food in there, because like I said about the avocado pits or the orange rinds or the avocado peels, you know, you're going to have to separate the worms from the castings, and you're going to have to separate all that food stuff that never decomposed or got mushy enough for them to eat. So go ahead and just stop feeding them, so you don't have to worry about that food stuff being in there. Give them at least, I would say at least 2 or 3 weeks to just sort of live on their own. Like I say, they'll find some newspaper, they'll find some bits here and there, they'll find their castings, but by the time you're ready to harvest it, it'll really just be the worms and the castings and whatever newspaper scraps are left. You don't have to worry about having fresh food or anything like that.
Great. Another question is, how many worms should I start with for a single bin?
Excuse me, I'm sorry. I would say, I mean, a half dozen to a dozen will do it. Some people talk about it in terms of pounds. Oh, you want a 1/4 pound of worms, or maybe up to a pound of worms. Some people also say it depends on the size of your bin. The thing is, the worms will populate to the size of your bin, so don't worry about that too much. I don't think you need to have too many. I literally, the first time I started, I don't think I had more than 6 or 8 worms. And 6 months later, I know I had hundreds and hundreds of worms. So I would say a dozen is kind of maybe a nice number just to start with. They will eat and they will reproduce. Like I say, they are prodigious. They stay very busy. So your job is to keep them cool, moist, and dark, and give them some food every now and then. But they will do the rest.
I think you kind of answered this one, but I'll just ask again. It's a different form of the question. How much do you feed the worms?
So yeah, so like I say, I freeze it and I pull it out like once a week. I have a large bin and a small bin, and it really depends on what stage I'm in. I cleaned out my bins a couple of months ago, so I'm not feeding them as much. But in 2 or 3 months from now, I will be feeding them a lot more, because there's going to be a lot more worms there. So once again, if you feed them and you open it a week later and there's a bunch of food left, you overfed them, it's not going to kill them. Worms are not going to overeat. They're going to eat what they need. They're just going to ignore the rest. If you feed them and you come back and there's all the food is gone, you're going to maybe say, oh, I underfed them. So just adjust accordingly. Like I say, you're not gonna kill them by overfeeding them. What you're gonna do is you're gonna open up the bin and you're gonna see a bunch of moldy food that they never got around to eating.
Is there a recommended number of bins per garden area as a starting guideline?
You mean, not really. You mean to sort of net enough castings to feed a garden? I haven't really heard any sort of thing about that. I know if you have a big garden, you're going to want more worm castings. But like I say, a nice full Ziploc bag is going to translate to a lot of healthy soil, because you're going to mix it 4 parts potting soil to 1 part worm castings, and that'll go pretty far. You don't need a lot of worm castings to make a big difference. You need to sprinkle it around and water it significantly to dissolve it, or you need to mix it with your potting soil if you're going to put it in potted plants, or put it around your plants or around in your garden bed. But I haven't heard of any ratio of like the number of compost bins you would need to yield the right amount of castings for the size of the bed. I could look into that if you like, but I've never heard that from any of the gardeners I've worked with.
Good answer. Is there a way that the bins can actually become overpopulated?
The worms will not overpopulate. They will not. They're smart. They eat what they need, and they won't overeat. Like I say, the food will just start going bad if they don't want it, because they're going to eat what they need, and they're not going to overpopulate. The lid's not going to start popping off this thing like popcorn, you know. They are going to populate to their environment. And like I say, once you harvest and there's more space, they're going to start reproducing again. When they feel like they have enough, you know, to their space, they're going to stop reproducing. They really are very easy to manage, and it's a great way to divert waste. It's a great way to have great plant food for your garden or your potted plants. And it's really easy. They're really not a lot of work at all. It's just getting it started and keeping an eye on them and harvesting it maybe twice a year. Sometimes I do it once a year because it might average out to like every 8 or 9 months. It's really easy. You don't have to worry about that sort of thing, like overpopulation.
We have a couple more questions. What about breaking down the bins? Let's say I'm moving and realize I can no longer tend to vermicomposting.
So I would treat it like a regular harvest. I mean, if you're moving and you can put it in your back seat and take it to your new place, that's one way to do it. If you're doing a longer move than that, you really have to, I would just treat it like a regular harvest. I would separate them and try to find a way to use the castings. Often your neighbors would love to have the castings. If you don't want to figure out a way to disperse it in your garden or in your potting soil. As far as the worms go, you can always call us. We know a lot of people who do this, and we can try to find a good home for your worms. There's always people who are looking for free worms. We're happy to hook them up. Or once again, ask your neighbors, hey, have you ever been interested in vermicomposting? Maybe they'll take the entire bin, or maybe they'll just take your worms. People who garden really believe in vermicomposting. They notice the difference of what it does for their vegetables and their flowers, and you know, they know how effective worm castings are.
If you mix the castings with soil, will it keep? And if so, how long?
If you mix it with soil, it will keep. And the nice thing about compost, both regular composting and worm castings, is that they break down over time. Over like 6 months, they're still breaking down. So like I said earlier, when you use plant food, you're feeding the plant, and but it's immediate. If you're using castings or compost, you're feeding the soil, and it's happening over the course of time. And so it's a better way to feed them, as long as you don't shock them and do it too much. You know, that's why you want to dilute the castings with the soil. But it's going to last for 6 months or a year. It's going to keep breaking down over time.
A question kind of in the similar vein is, if it's time to harvest the castings, but you don't need it for the garden at that time, is there a way to hold on to it?
So, in my experience, and this isn't like maybe the best answer, because maybe there is a way to hold on to it. Maybe you can freeze it. I've never tried. But my experience is I have held on to it for a couple of weeks, and that's when it starts to stink. That's when it starts to smell more like animal manure. You know, it really smells, doesn't smell too much when you have it all in a bag and it's all concentrated, you know. It's got a little odor, but it's not like dog or horse or anything, you know, like that. It's not a perfect smell, but it's not horrible. But when you keep them in a bag and you kind of let it just kind of fester in there or heat up in there, I have found that it does start stinking much worse. You remember, oh yeah, worms are animals too. And so I wouldn't hold on to it too much. I would either use it, dilute it, and use it right away, or try to spread it around your lawn and water it, or share it with friends or gardeners, you know, and let them have it.
If you feed your worms a consistent diet of something high in nitrogen, like coffee grounds, does this mean their castings will be high in nitrogen and be lacking in other nutrients?
I do think it's best to give them a well-rounded diet. Some of that's going to happen naturally just from the newspaper and some of the, the things that you're going to add in there. But I would not recommend, and yes, you can make it so that you want it to have some phosphorus, you want it to have some potassium, some magnesium, some nitrogen, whatever. You don't want it to just be one of those things, So I wouldn't just make it a coffee diet. I wouldn't just make it a watermelon diet. I would try to make it well-rounded so that they do have all of those little individual nutrients in their castings.
How long does it take to break down? How often do you harvest?
So I harvest every 6 to 8 months. Sometimes I'm ready to harvest, but I got to wait for good weather. I'm not motivated if it's rainy or if it's too hot. So there's like a 2-month window there when I'm thinking I'm ready to harvest, and I kind of like prep for it and stop feeding them and all that stuff. But you won't need to harvest more than twice a year, and maybe once a year is enough.
If I want to go on vacation, how long can I leave worms in a bin without killing them?
So that's a great question. Thank you. I should have mentioned that. It's safe to leave them. They will eat their newspaper. They will eat their castings. They will eat. You can feed them right before you go. Certainly if you're on a week vacation, it's absolutely no problem. The bigger thing is where you're leaving them. And if you're leaving them in the summer, you can't leave them where the sun is going to hit it directly and start melting those worm castings and turning it into a hot soup that'll burn them up. So it's really, when you're going away on vacation, it's more where you're leaving them than how you're feeding them, if that's a fair way to answer it. They will survive on what they have, their worm castings, their newspaper, the food you're going to leave behind. Just, you got to make sure it's not going to overheat or freeze while you're gone. If you have it on the ground, that water's not going to get in it or something, So make sure if you're going to go away for a while that you leave it in a safe place where it's going to stay cool enough, warm enough, drafty enough, all that stuff, so that our worms can stay cool, moist, and dark.